24. Aranya joined Kai, Talon, and the other wardens circling the burned spot on the ground. No singed grass remained, no shred of fabric from the clothes on the body. Nothing was left except scorched earth. Ice swept down her spine, and she turned rounded eyes up to Kai next to her. He flicked a glance her way in response, his jaw taut. Talon growled under his breath and said to the wardens, "Bring this information back to your supervisor. There's no need to remain here gawking." The wardens shuffled off, leaving the three of them alone. "This could only have been a fire wielder or a Mwagwe," Aranya said quietly. "Nothing else could have burned so thoroughly." "A Mwagwe would have eaten the body, not burned it away," Kai said with a trace of ire. "Not a Mwagwe." "I don't care what did this. I care about why," Talon snapped. "Why leave the body until now, only to destroy it the moment someone happens upon it? Why not decimate it in the first place?" "What if the first attacker didn't have the ability?" she offered. "Left it until the others could come and finish the job." "There's more than one way to dispose of a body, Chilling Brain. I'm not asking your opinion, Shi Kai." "Will the both of you shut up? Can't think with all of your squabbling." Aranya glowered and crossed her arms. Kai shifted his weight to his other leg, and likewise crossed his own arms. Talon, nose in the air, sniffed ahead around the blackened spot. Just as quickly, he pulled back, his face twisting as he coughed and shook his head. "Smoky." She chewed on the inside of her cheek, trying to decide if she should say something about that being obvious. In the end, she kept her mouth shut. "Smoky. Like the smell back in Lord Swan's office?" Kai asked. Talon's face was hard as he stared at the burned patch. "It's the same, but smoky smells aren't as distinct. Any number of fiery things could smell the same. It burns away the subtler individual smells. Did either of you find out what sort of wielder our poor victim here was?" "He was feral," Kai said. "Similar magic to yours, but less powerful. He was sent to investigate the Guardian's disappearance, because the supervisor doubted the capital would send anyone within a reasonable time frame." Aranya turned her glower on him. "And how did you find that out?" His face split into a lopsided grin. "That girl told you, didn't she? After you flirted with her?" Kai merely shrugged. "Flirting can be productive in more ways than one." "Seven Valleys," she huffed, skirting away from him to Talon's side. "If he was feral," Talon said, ignoring them, "then he would have likely caught the same scent I have. Which means—" "Someone didn't want him following this trail," Aranya finished for him. He nodded, eyes lifting to the horizon. "This trail may be more dangerous than we originally expected." Aranya followed the trajectory of his gaze, her blood simmering in her veins. Dangerous or not, she wasn't messing up this chance. She gritted her teeth and set her face north. Mounted up, armed to the teeth, and prepared for more nights out in the wilderness, Aranya and Kai followed Talon's nose. The hours were dull beyond belief. Now that Talon was so focused, he wouldn't acknowledge a word from her. And Kai was, well, Kai. Evening fell, bringing with it relief from the heat. They dismounted, hobbling their horses for the night, and set about making camp. "These nights are getting chilly," Aranya said, drawing her cloak tighter around her shoulders. "I hardly know what to pack these days. Hot in the day, cold at night. It's all so confusing." Her companions ignored her. "All right then," she muttered, letting her smile drift into something tighter, firmer. "I'll go fetch wood for the night." She waited for a moment, glancing between Kai crouching on the ground, striking flint on tinder near his pile of kindling, and Talon, who seemed unable to get the scent of their trail out of his nostrils. He kept pulling out one of his handkerchiefs, taking a big whiff as though to clear his scent palate, only to jerk his nose into the air a few minutes later. She stood, patted the knife at her hip by habit, and checked her new holstered jian. Then she strode off into the woods, refusing to glance back at the men. If they wanted to be boring, that was their problem. She wouldn't worry about it. And it wasn't like she cared what they thought of her beyond their professional esteem, which she definitely didn't have, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was solving this mystery and getting back safely to Ye. A few steps into the forest, and the night seemed to swallow her whole. The sounds of crooning and cricketing bugs surrounded her. Underbrush crunched beneath her feet, and she took minor pains to be quiet. After all, there probably wasn't anything stalking the woods this early. Most Mwagwe came out later in the night. As she bent down to collect sticks, her hand unconsciously moved to touch her knife again, just to be certain it was there. Now that she was out here, alone, in the dark, her spine tingled. "Being Talon would sure be nice," she whispered into the darkness. "Night vision and a nose to rival wolves. Maybe I should have let him do this." Her eyes strained. She moved quicker, collecting as much brush as she could fill her arms with. She found a fallen tree with larger branches that would be perfect for smoldering all night. A second trip might be necessary for those, however. A light flickered in the dark. Their campfire? Had Kai gotten it going, even without her coming back with wood? Had she come from that direction? She thought she'd come from the other direction. Aranya paused, heart thudding too loudly in the night, and slowly turned around. Her arms braced around her pile of wood, but she flicked her right wrist and shifted her hand into Talons. The light flickered. At first, she thought it was blue, but then it softened into a welcoming orange glow. That had to be the campfire. She'd take this load back, shake off her own stupid premonition, and then return for the second. Her feet started moving, almost of their own accord, toward the light. With each step, the light flickered, flashing blue and then back to orange. She frowned, went to open her mouth to call for Kai or Talon. "What a pretty light!" she heard herself saying. She swallowed, clutching her wood tighter. Then, with a start, she glanced down and found her talons had vanished. And now she couldn't make herself shift. Instead, her arms were opening. Her full collection of brush fell to the ground with a noisy clatter. Could her companions hear? Would they come find her? Why should it matter? She was going to them, heading toward the light. Once she was there, she would simply have to tell them she'd dropped the wood. She shook her head, gritting her teeth. What was she thinking? Her mind went muddier, and if she didn't have that light to guide her back... "What a pretty light," she said. She clamped her mouth shut, glowering at no one. When she opened it again, "What a pretty light." A wordless growl escaped her throat. Her feet kept moving. She tried to trip herself on a fallen log, but she stepped cleanly over it, toward the light. Panic flared full and heady in her blood, her vision, until she nearly screamed in frustration and fear, "What a pretty light!" But she couldn't allow herself to say it again. She bit her tongue, tasting copper and sticky bile. "Think, Aranya, think!" But she couldn't. Her brain was no more her own than her stupid, dragon-eaten feet that wouldn't stop dragging her toward the Qilin-scorched light. The light was closer now. The welcoming orange leaked away entirely, leaving nothing but blue fire in its wake. Except that it wasn't fire. It was something else, something not physical at all. She drew nearer on incessant feet, her hand reaching out of its own accord, toward the dancing little blue light. "What a pretty light," she choked, a sob clogging her throat so she could hardly breathe. She stepped on a twig, cracking it with such resounding loudness that it seemed to split the night clean in half. Her heart sputtered within her, her arm aching as she continued holding it out toward the light. The bugs were silent. They had been silent for some time now, but it wasn't until she stepped on the twig that she realized it. And it wasn't just that the bugs were silent. A new sound replaced them. A low humming. But not deep, per se. It was soft, pitched high like a mother's lullaby. Now that it caught her focus, it was almost deafening. There seemed to be words strung along those notes, buried deep beneath its melody. She couldn't touch the flickering blue light before her. It hung suspended above the world like dancing poison, ready to strike the moment her traitorous finger came too close. She couldn't touch it. Somehow, she knew if she did, she would die. She fought it, growling soundlessly as her muscles quivered under the strain of conflicting forces. Her growl turned into a cry, then a sob. Her legs were cooked strings of noodles beneath her, yet she couldn't make herself collapse onto the ground. She tried once more to call for help. All that came out was a tremulous, "What a pretty light." Then, out of nowhere, a face appeared before her, cutting off the vision of the light. It was so dark she couldn't make it out entirely, but her hand flagged, falling to her side. Her knees buckled. Her mind cleared so suddenly it was like being dunked headfirst into icy water. The relief was so profound, she fell against the dark figure's chest. Hands closed around her elbows, supporting her, and she recognized that grip. She gasped, "Kai," and could have wept with relief that her tongue was back under her ownership.
"Should have known you'd get yourself into trouble the instant you were alone,"
came Kai's unmistakable, irritated voice.
"Get out of the lure before we both get ensnared."
Lure? As soon as she spoke it, realization hit. Oh, a siren set this lure.
"And it's nearly as powerful of a lure as they come,"
he growled, not glancing back over his shoulder at the blue light that probably still shone. Then his voice turned wry.
"You can keep clinging to me if you so please, but it's hard to walk."
She blinked. Her face was still pressed into his chest, her hands fisted in folds of his robes. "Oh!" she squeaked, pushing away from him even as he released his grip on her elbows. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—"
"It's fine. I did just save your life. I can even carry you back if you'd like."
Aranya stopped, glancing up at the dark face before her. White teeth flashed from a devilish grin. "7 valleys, I almost died, and you can't be a little more gentlemanly?"
"I offered to carry you."
"In your most mocking tone. For the love of the fathers, I'm not Lord Mong's sniveling daughter." He snorted and strode past her.
"Keep up, partial. And you're welcome."
She growled, hurrying after him.
"You stink at gathering brush,"
Kai said after a few minutes. She probably would have retorted something, but relief still coursed heady and overwhelming through her veins. All that she managed to utter was a simple question. "How did you know to come looking for me?"
"When you took 1.5 million years doing a very simple task."
"I was gone that long?"
"Over half an hour."
"Fathers," she breathed, dragging a hand down her face. "I am such an idiot."
"No one could have resisted that lure,"
Kai said, and she blinked at the slight softening in his tone.
"We'll have to discuss it with Talons."
"A lure like that shouldn't be out here," she mumbled. When she closed her eyes, she saw that dancing flame that seemed eerily like a disembodied soul. She shuddered, opening her eyes again. Warm, real firelight filled her vision.
"A lure like that shouldn't be set to catch any unsuspecting person," he said. "And few sirens can even set lures. Most only have simple tricks like the brigand we arrested."
He was right on both accounts. "But even lures are set using those black stones, right?" Aranya asked. "So tomorrow, when it's light, we should hunt for the stone anchoring this lure. Don't you think it's kind of suspicious? Her foot twisted in the uneven ground, and she yelped as she tripped. But Kai's arm darted out and caught her around the waist, keeping her upright. She shuddered out a deep breath, her legs still wobbling, as she lifted her head from where her hands had planted on his chest, to the glitter of his eyes staring down at her.
"Are you all right?"
he asked, his voice painted in a shade of concern that seemed out of character for him. She fumbled to get her balance, ended up hanging heavier on him as she got her feet under her. Then she scrambled backward a few steps. He let her go quickly.
"What's suspicious?"
he asked, his voice slightly roughened. She blinked. What had she been talking about? Oh, the lure. That it's right on our trail? If we hadn't stopped for the night, we'd have walked right into it. All three of us. Kai didn't respond, but his frown and half-glance back toward her was loud enough. 25.
"You were ensnared in a lure?"
Talon burst out. Aranya stood still, mouth drawn in a thin line. Her legs wobbled slightly, but she was steadier now than she had been before. Enough that she wasn't worried she'd collapse again into Kai's arms. He, on the other hand, seemed to be eyeing her like he was afraid she'd do just that. "Yes, I was," she said. The next words were even more begrudging than the first. "Kai saved me."
"We'll have to investigate it,"
Talon muttered, tossing a log into the fire from the pile that Kai and Aranya had brought back when returning from the forest.
"Very suspicious, but no use doing it in the dark. No one better fall asleep on their watch tonight. A lure like that could mean brigands in these parts."
She nodded in acknowledgement, while Kai merely sat down by the fire wordlessly. "How did you not get caught too?" Aranya asked Kai abruptly, drawing her cloak tighter around her shoulders as the air turned chillier.
"By my astute observation skills."
Talon snorted.
"I'm going to sleep now. No time for Wei Chi tonight. If you two are going to stay up late chattering, keep it quiet."
"We're not going to," Kai said dryly, pulling his bedroll from the pile of saddles by the fire.
"Aranya will take first watch, though I'm not sure she can be trusted to not get caught in the lure again."
Not knowing what else to do in response, she flashed him a snarl of a smile and settled herself on the ground near the fire for watch. Talon rolled over so his back was to them and promptly erupted into a chorus of snores. Kai was about to do the same when Aranya whispered, "Really, Kai, how did you not get caught? The moment I saw the light, I couldn't escape. I didn't know how to break out of it either, and if you hadn't—" She stopped herself, before anything slipped between her lips that she'd regret later. Kai, half tucked into his bedroll, glanced her way and smirked.
"Now we're expressing some measure of thanks."
"Kai." He shrugged, laid down on the ground, and closed his eyes.
"Talon asked me to go find you when you didn't come back. I wasn't about to walk straight down the path you took, because if you did run into something, I'd run into it too. I went around and saw you following something. Your eyes were all glazed, and you looked—"
He paused, his smile slipping into a frown. "I looked what?" She didn't bother hiding the ire in her tone.
"Freakish. I realized it was a lure and saw that you were caught in it. That's when I appeared in front of you, to cut off your line of sight and not risk my own neck. There. That was how I did it. Are you taking notes?"
The eyes-closed smirk was back. She didn't respond. Instead, she rifled through her saddlebags and pulled out the folder with the information on Swan 1. In her periphery, she saw that Kai opened one eye to peer at her when she was silent. But she ignored him, thumbing through the documents. The parchments were the worse for wear, but nothing that compromised their readability. She skimmed the first few pages, tucking stray hairs behind her ears. It was information she had largely memorized already, but something kept her flipping until the last several pages. She had skimmed over these because they didn't have information that she believed especially pertinent, but now her brows knit as she examined them closer. It was a record of all the missing wielders. By each name was a sketch of their face, a physical description, and the length of their disappearance. She studied Leigh. The healer had not always been a pretty girl, but in recent years she'd blossomed into someone quite lovely. Her midnight eyes had always been her most striking feature, but the sketch didn't show that to full advantage. It did catch, however, the wry upturn of her lips. She wore that expression whenever she wasn't grinning outright, like she was silently laughing at them all. The entire academy had had something of a fascination for her. Being the only healer in generations, she was special. All the boys wanted to get her attention and marry her, which might have been the result of scheming parents trying to claim the healer's future bloodline and the prestige she bore. But Aranya had always thought that, despite that twisting mouth and the fire in her eyes, Fayen had seemed worn. Like the long days of healing and academy rigor squeezed the life out of her soul. Was the healer all right? Was she suffering under the heavy hand of her captors? Next was the sketch of Xuan. He was very serious, his bearded chin tilted up slightly. He was middle-aged, not particularly handsome, but there was a ruddy sort of power communicated through the drawing. When she skimmed the other drawings, she could not find a single one with the same determined set of jaw. Such a powerful wielder. An image of his ransacked study flashed through her mind. The vines he spelled and manipulated had been powerful enough to tear through stone and wood. And yet, they had not been enough to save him. The fire crackled before her, and absently, Aranya added another log. Kai's much quieter snores added to Talons. Something just didn't sit right about this case. Kidnapping a healer made sense. Anyone would want control over the one person in the Empire who could heal any physical ailment. But kidnapping one of the Guardians? One of the most powerful ones at that? Why would anyone be so foolhardy? Perhaps even more pressing, who was powerful enough to accomplish such a feat? Finally, Aranya's eyes drifted down to the sketch she'd set out to study. Leigh, the missing siren. She had enormous eyes, rounded and fanned with lashes. The lines of her face were soft, almost seductive. If her plump lips spread in a smile, she could waggle her finger at any man. Usually women in Junninghai kept their hair bound up in some way, but in the sketch, her hair was free, loose, and long. She certainly fit the stereotype of sirens. Perhaps she was the reason behind the stereotype. Aranya looked up from the sketch to the woods where she'd found the lure. Kai had earlier said what she already knew. Not many sirens could set lures, especially lures that were nearly impossible to escape. She chewed on her chapped lips. Could she have said it? She whispered aloud. She looked back down at the brief description and noted the city she had disappeared from. One far south from here, near the coast. If Leigh had set this lure after she'd disappeared, could she send for information from Suguan? She wanted to know exactly how many sirens in the Empire could set lures and where they were all located. Additionally, she wanted to know if Leigh had ever been this far north. She should have kept a record of the lures she set to be in compliance with the government code, Aranya mumbled, glancing again toward the dark forest line. Theoretically, I should be able to obtain a list of every snare set in the Empire, but surely this one couldn't have been a legal snare. For what purpose? Unless, of course, the siren who'd set this was a brigand, a hidden one like Leigh, only far more powerful. A lure like that could mean brigands in these parts. That was what Talon had said. What if... Was it possible that Leigh could have deserted? Become a brigand? And then used her magic to overwhelm Swan-Wan? Aided by whoever had killed the warden in Shawnet? But why? Aranya sat for hours, pondering these mysteries. She was so caught up in her thoughts that she nearly forgot to wake Kai for the second watch. Only her own aching eyelids made her remember. He groaned when she tapped on his shoulder and sat up, blinking and rubbing his eyes.
The next morning, Kai tried to block out Aranya's incessant chattering as she passed out rice cakes and jerky for breakfast. His brain was muddled from fitful sleep. The last thing he needed was all her half-brained theories about the lore she'd stumbled into last night. She was far too eager to go investigate now that day had dawned. Kai was only eager for one thing: more sleep. Talons seemed to be in a similar mood, for he muttered, "I'm sure your ideas are wonderful." Aranya's chipper tone faltered slightly, but she shrugged and settled herself on the ground. "Anyone else sore? I'm terribly sore. It's like being back at the academy." Kai had hardly finished swallowing his half-chewed breakfast before she was leaping up and fastening on her weapons. "I have some ideas," she continued. "What's the nearest city? Can we stop there to send a message? I have a few pieces of information that I'd like to request. It's not about Swan-Wan directly, but I have a hunch about this lore, and I think it might be connected to him. After all, we're still on his trail. Doesn't it seem weird that it would lead right to a snare? What if this was set to ensnare anyone pursuing them? I'd like to find out how many sirens in the Empire can set lures, if there are any near here, and if there's any record of Leigh being in these parts. Also, I'd like to see if there's record of this one." Kai sat up straighter, darting a look at Talon. Leigh? Did she think the vanished siren set this? Talon seemed to be waiting for her to stop talking. Once she did, and turned back toward her weapons, he said, "The nearest city is Tsushui." Aranya's sheathed knife slipped to the dirt. She blinked, glancing between Talon and Kai. Kai met her gaze, and something about her surprise woke him enough to give her a tiny smirk, just enough to make her look back at Talon. "Tsushui?" she repeated, her voice suddenly breathless. Kai watched her carefully, though trying to keep an air of disinterest about him. "Could we stop there?" Aranya asked, her voice sounding thin, like she held her breath. Her eyes never strayed from Talon's. "So I can send the messages?" Talon squared his elbows on his knees. "Just to send messages? I smell ulterior motives on you, girl." A flush stained her cheeks and the tips of her ears, but she simply said, "My grandfather is there too. I would love to see how he's doing. I haven't left him alone this long." She squared her shoulders and cleared her throat. "May we stop?" Talon blinked a few times, lowering his eyes as if pondering something. Then, with a groan like he was an old man, he got to his feet and began strapping his weapons to his belt. "I can tell you right now, there will be no record of this lure. Lures and snares of any type aren't meant to capture any unsuspecting wielders. They're supposed to be set for specific people, or beasts. One this elaborate would have safeguards against what happened last night if it were a proper lore, made in accordance with Empire guidelines. This lore was made outside of the Emperor's sanction. Thus, it was made by a brigand, or someone like Leigh." Kai stared at Talon, his mind trying to grapple with the implications of what he said. He glanced toward Aranya, who was smiling triumphantly. "I thought so," she said. He frowned, running a hand through his hair. Fathers, it could use a good wash. He didn't want to wonder how Aranya had stumbled onto that suspicion. But then, his eyes landed on the folder she tucked back into her saddlebags. Apparently, she'd been much more productive than him during her watch. Which was fine. So long as this got done, it didn't matter who did more or less work. He only wanted to get back to his post at Sushui, preferably with his rival having found a different position elsewhere. An image flashed in his mind of her, curled up beneath a tattered blanket with a fluffy white cat in her arms, her long dark hair falling over her head, cushion, and shoulders, brows knit, the glimmer of tears in the shadow of her nose. And then a different image of her, eyes widened like moons in the darkness of an inn, her tears leaking between his fingers, the whimper on her lips. Why had his mouth suddenly gone dry? Why did his chest feel tighter? He wasn't responsible for what happened to her and her grandcat when she lost her post in Sushui. Besides, if things went well on this mission, she might even find a better position. If things went well. Delan sighed. Let's go investigate that lore. And then we can stop by Sushui? Aranya asked, clasping her hands and grinning girlishly. Maybe.
"26.
We'll need to determine if the lure is still active, Aranya said. If it is, then we have to deactivate it before we investigate it. Kai rolled his eyes, tempted to spout something snappy in retort. He held himself back, however, seeing that she only spoke to herself. As they approached, she muttered under her breath, things that sounded like an academy checklist, one that Kai had certainly never taken the time to read, much less memorize. Then we find the pressure point. That's where the black stone is. If we can dislodge it, that should be enough to dismantle it, she muttered. Delan glanced Kai's way, an amused glint in his eyes. Kai returned it. All right, Miss Textbook, Delan said. You enter the forest like you did last night. We'll see if it ensnares you again. But I've already been caught once. How about Kai gets caught this time? His magic makes him the ideal person to ensure none of us gets too close, Delan replied coolly. He'll watch you for signs of being ensnared and intervene before it's too late. I'll watch and determine the next step once we know whether the lure is active, and once we have an idea of where the pressure point is. Aranya looked like she wanted to protest, but she shrugged and sighed instead. Very well, give me some space while I go trap myself. Kai didn't wait for the signal from Delan. He evanesced away to the clearing where he had found Aranya last night. It took him 3 jumps because of all the trees, but it was out of the line of sight of whatever had lured her, yet still in full view of her. He crouched behind a tree for extra protection, although he didn't care, or perhaps more aptly, didn't want to care. Adrenaline surged in his blood. It was rather like the feeling of stepping out in the wildness of academy hunts. It wasn't a battle, but there remained the thrill of the unknown, like danger could leap out from the shadows at any moment. But that was an exciting sort of danger. Not all danger was equally thrilling. He knew that fact well. Aranya moved surprisingly swiftly into the forest, directly toward where she had encountered the lure. Had it been him, he would have skulked along the edges, trying to get close without being caught. She just plowed right in. He wanted to call it only carelessness and stupidity, but somehow, that wasn't just it. She was fearless. The admission tasted like ashes in his mouth. She leapt into things not because she was stupid, but because she wasn't afraid. Kai had always thought his holding back was because he was merely cautious and careful. But was that all? Or perhaps, was he more fearful than he wanted to admit? He slid his fingers down the leather strap running across his chest, just to ensure he'd remembered to strap his broadsword to his back. Kai saw the very moment Aranya was ensnared in the lure. He straightened, every muscle tensing as he steadied his breathing into the controlled measures of a warrior. Aranya's eyes went glazed, her sure footsteps suddenly mechanical. Her lips opened, shut, opened, shut. Her brows puckered, her fisted hand upraising to touch something. It was a strong snare. He hadn't seen many, only the ones they'd used for training back at the academy. He could nearly smell the power pulsing in this one. Blue light flared in her drawn face. She was resisting it. She was strong, but the lure was stronger.
"Did it catch her?"
came Talons' shout.
"Yes,"
Kai shouted back.
"Can we come up behind it? Or does it work every way? I'll check."
Kai rose to his feet, keeping one eye on Aranya's progress as he carefully glanced around the other side of the tree. All he could see in the opposite direction were sunbeams cutting through the forest foliage. He evanesced to another tree and double-checked his line of sight to ensure that when he evanesced in front of Aranya, he'd only have to do it in one jump.
"Are you finding anything?"
Talons said. His voice sounded nearer, and Kai turned to see him crouching behind another tree, in case Kai got caught too.
"I don't see any effects of the lure on the opposite side, but I cannot be sure. No glow reflecting on the trees or anything?"
Nothing.
"How's Aranya?"
She's getting closer. Her footsteps are slowing, like she's fighting extra hard.
"Can you pinpoint the location of the lure?"
Kai frowned, glancing back toward Aranya's puckered face. Blue light shone brighter in her eyes.
"I have a general idea. Should I intervene now? Wait a bit longer, in case it's farther than we realize."
Uneasiness churned in his gut, but he remained where he was. His fingers curled into the bark on the tree he sheltered behind, digging into the dirty, sap-lined crevices. He didn't let his eyes leave his comrade. If he waited 1 second too late, it could spell her death, or imprisonment in a cage nearly impossible to break.
"I think she's very close to it,"
Kai said, trying to keep the alarm out of his voice.
"I can see her now. She's still got a few more steps at least. Don't we have what we need now?"
The more precise we have of the location, the slimmer the chances we have of getting caught in it. Kai clenched his jaw. Aranya's voice spilled from her lips.
"What a pretty light."
Her voice grew louder as she began repeating the phrase, "What a pretty light! What a pretty light!" Panic laced the syllables. "Now? No."
"Spitfire,"
Kai cursed under his breath, driving his nails into the tree bark.
"Dragon-blasted Spitfire!"
"What a pretty light!" came Aranya's shriek.
"Now!"
Talons shouted. Kai evanesced in a flash, appearing directly in front of her. It was like last night, except that he could see better when her eyes cleared like clouds drifting away after a storm to reveal a blue sky. She gasped, putting up her fisted hands against his chest for support, keeping herself from stumbling into him. She was short enough that with him this close, there was no chance that she'd see the siren's luring light.
"You both,"
she gasped again, lowering her head as she braced herself. Kai's hands hovered in midair above her back, not sure if he ought to offer stability or leave her alone. He stared down at her, waiting.
"Phoenix spawn!"
Aranya cried, her head shooting up so she could glare at him. Her fists clenched tighter around his tunic.
"Both of you! Phoenix spawn! What is wrong with you? Waiting until the last dragon-eaten second?
You thought I'd neglect to save a damsel in distress?" Kai smirked, ignoring his own relief. "I'm glad to see how little faith you have in me. Though for being technical,
I wasn't the one who wanted to wait.
Talon, you cracked dragon egg! She shouted, pushing away from Kai.
You're just fine,
Came the returning shout from somewhere in the trees.
Now find the pressure point of the snare.
Aranya huffed, folding her arms across her chest and returning her glare to Kai. Not knowing what else to do, he flashed a grin her way and said, "Would you like to do the honors?" She stared at him, shifting her weight so she could cock one knee. Her answering smile was hardly a smile at all. It was pure challenge. "Very well, I shall." Kai remained standing, blocking the light, as she crouched down to the ground. She kept her eyes closed as she reached a hand around him and began patting the dirt, looking for the black stone. Hopefully it was on the ground and not tucked into a tree knot or something else that would be much more difficult to locate blindly. "Found it!" Aranya cried triumphantly, her grin turning genuine.
Hand it to me, and I'll take it to Talon for inspection, Kai said, holding out his palm.
Some instinctive part of him made him close his eyes as her hand knocked around in the air, searching for his. Finally, there was the brush of her warm fingers, contrasting with smooth cold. The stone was heavier than he expected, making his arm dip slightly. "Now you can open your eyes," he said, right before he evanesced away. He might have said it more to himself than to her. Once she had picked it up off the ground, that would be enough to dislodge the spell and make it lose its power. He forced himself to open his eyes as he reappeared in the clearing where Talon had been safely hiding, forced himself to look down at the stone he held in his palm. It looked just like the stone the other siren had placed under the bed of Lord Meng's daughter, except the stone itself was not merely polished black, but flecked with veiny bits of gold. "Here's the stone." Kai held it out toward Talon.
Perfect.
Talon rolled his shoulders and stood to accept it. The change in the older wielder was immediate, and so sudden, Kai almost didn't have time to evanesce backwards several steps. Talon's eyes glazed over, glowing with reflected blue light that came from nowhere. He reached out a hand, fingers stretched toward the stone in Kai's hand. His steps turned wooden. "7 valleys!" Kai gasped, leaping backward. He clamped his other hand over the stone, but it made no difference. He tried shoving it in his pocket. No avail. But Talon did not move slowly like Aranya had. He pounced, a very animal movement, all while shrieking,
What a pretty light! What a pretty light!
Kai evanesced further away, stumbling as he reappeared and falling on his backside. Aranya emerged from the trees to his right, then Talon from his left. Her face was pained, anxious, with a deeply furrowed brow over her glazed eyes. But she fought it. Talon, however, ran on all fours toward Kai. 7 valleys, Kai exclaimed again. Talon moved so fast that Kai barely rolled and evanesced away in time. Why wasn't the spell affecting him? Was it because he bore it? Something told him that if he handed over the stone to either of them, whatever trap the spell contained would be activated. So why was he able to hold it and not be trapped by it? Was it because he'd closed his eyes when he picked it up? Aranya had done the same. Whatever the case, he had to get rid of it. Now. It didn't matter that they wouldn't be able to investigate it, not if it was going to kill them. As Talon's grappling hands came reaching for him, Kai remembered a lake they'd passed nearby. He couldn't reach it in one jump, but he vanished right before Talon reached the stone, and because he hadn't angled himself properly, found himself a mere foot away on the opposite side of a tree. Growling, he evanesced again and again, cutting through the forest. Forest evanescing was just the worst. He finally picked up speed the thinner the trees became, until, at long last, he reappeared on the edge of the lake. His knees nearly sagged in relief. With an inarticulate cry, he raced toward the lake and hurled the black stone as far as he could into the lake. Human eyes would never see the wretched thing again. When he'd made it back to their camp, Aranya was saddling her mount, and Talon was furiously throwing loose items in his saddlebag, his face an utter storm cloud. None of them said anything, not as they disguised their campsite and mounted up for another long day ahead.
27.
I smelled it,
Growled Talon. He'd been even sourer than Kai for the last hour, refusing to talk as they mounted up and continued on their way. There had been no more investigation of the snare after Kai had gotten rid of it. Smelled what? Asked Aranya.
On the lure. There was a smell that I caught a whiff of in Lord Swan's office.
So, whoever set this lure was there when Lord Swan was abducted? Talon nodded grimly.
Your theory might not be far off. A siren could have aided in the Guardian's abduction.
And if Kong Leigh was the one who did—
We don't know that,
snapped Talon. Aranya flinched unintentionally and could almost feel Kai's eyes on her back, judging her for being so easily ruffled. She drew in a deep breath and forced her shoulders to relax. It seems like we should try to confirm that if we can.
It would save us some money if we spent the night in Sushui,
Kai said from the back.
Aranya and I both have tenements. You could stay with me, Talon. Then we wouldn't have to sleep outside or rent a set of rooms at an inn.
Aranya, eyes bugged, twisted in her saddle to peer back at him. One of his eyebrows raised in response. She chewed on her lip, trying to decide if she should mouth a quick "thank you," but when he rolled his eyes, she shot him a glare instead and faced forward again in her saddle.
We'll stop,
growled Talon.
Send a message and then be on our way.
Thank you, she cried, a grin bursting out across her face. If they weren't mounted atop horses, she might have flung her arms around him and embraced him. But it was better this way. Such a display would not be very professional. She could hardly contain her excitement as they traveled into the afternoon. Behind the excitement, however, was a kernel of worry. What if— There were too many what-ifs to give thought to each. She tried not to consider them, tried to focus on the relief that she could see Yeah again and ensure he was all right. The result was that she grew more jittery by the hour, fiddling with her reins, adjusting her robes, inspecting her knives for nothing, and smacking her neck at the barest touch of anything that could possibly be a bug. Finally, they crested a hill, and down in the small valley lay the city of Sushui. The surface of Kongkai Lake glittered in the late afternoon sun, becoming a light source itself.
Try not to go galloping across the plains, please,
Talon said with a small smile. Apparently, the hours had taken the edge off his sour mood. She grinned at him and tightened her grip around the leathery reins in her hands. I'm doing my best. A mumble from behind her made her whirl in her saddle to look back at Kai. What did you say? She said, already bristling. He fought his smile, but it was a losing battle. His face split into a full grin, his eyes dancing with amusement.
I said nothing,
he replied, eyebrows arched in false innocence. Yes, you did. What did you say? It was mean, wasn't it? Talon sighed from the front and waved his hand in the air.
Enough of your bickering, or you'll force me to send a message of my own to Suguan. One saying my comrades are too busy fawning over each other to do their job well.
Aranya balked. Fawning? Over him? How could you possibly— There's no way. Talon turned and smirked at her. He just goaded her. He suddenly looked more like Kai than he ever had. She shut her mouth and glared at her horse's neck. It seemed to sense the mood of its rider because its ears flattened irritably. When they arrived in the city and Aranya vaulted out of her saddle, Kai grabbed its lead as Talon turned his horse toward the postal station to send the message. They might have shared a brief glance when Aranya sputtered, "Does this mean I can go?" She didn't know for sure, however, because she was racing away to her tenement, her satchel bouncing at her hip. At the sight of that familiar building, her heart skipped ahead several beats until it was nearly bursting in her chest. She skittered to a stop in front of the gate, swung it open, and practically leapt across the small yard to the door. It opened before she could turn the handle.
"Ah, Swoon Aranya. It's good you're back early, because we have some business to settle."
Her head jerked upward. There in the doorway stood the angular figure of her landlord, Shi Kai. Immediately, she bristled. "What do you want?" she growled, forcing herself to step back and not shove past him. Forced her hands behind her back so he wouldn't see the bulge of her claws as she fought her instinct to shift.
6 tongus! Your grandfather keeps tearing up my yard, trying to garden. It's getting out of hand, and if you don't pay the fine, I'll evict you both."
She stared at him, blinking. Injustice roiled in her blood, pounding in her ears. But she had to master herself. Leigh noticed, and his eyes narrowed.
"Careful, warden, else I inform your supervisor about the fight you and your fellow warden had in my yard here."
6 tongus, she gasped. "But I don't have that. I will have it soon once I complete this. Once I get paid." Leigh looked taken aback, as though not expecting this submissive answer. He quickly composed himself, straightening his spine and arching his neck so he could stare down his nose at her.
"You have 2 days."
He slammed the door in her face. Aranya stayed there for several minutes, staring at the closed door. Then, with a groan, she covered her face with her hands. Even if she were to request advance payment for this mission, it could never arrive in 2 days, especially if they were only staying 1 night here. There was no time to hunt for another tenement before they left at dawn tomorrow, much less time to move her grandfather. She couldn't ask Na to move him or help with the fine, could she? She already asked too much of Na. But perhaps, if Shi Kai really needed them to be tenants or he'd have an empty room, could she bluff him out of retracting the fine? It was risky, of course, but her options were slim. "I'll tell him we cannot afford the fine and that we'll have to move," she whispered. "But if I'm wrong and he does have other people looking to rent, then I'll have to move out." Ugh. She dragged her hands down her face and let them fall to her sides. She lifted her eyes to the door behind her, and with a deep breath, pushed it open. Their room was shortly down the hall, and she hurried toward it. She lifted her hand to knock, but paused. Her head drooped, anxiety and failure coiling in her gut, tight as a spring ready to explode. She couldn't let Ye worry. She couldn't let him see how anxious she was. Tap, tap, tap. It was strange to stand outside her own door, twiddling her fingers while waiting for admittance. But she'd given Na her key. "It's me, Aranya," she called. There was a rasp like a bolt sliding away, but the door didn't open. Hesitantly, Aranya turned the knob and gave a push. There, standing in his human form a few feet away, was her grandfather. Yeah, she cried, rushing into the room and flinging her arms around him. He chuckled, a low grating sound. "My little sunflower is back home." "Only for the night," she confessed, pulling back. "Has Na been taking care of you?"
"Someone's been taking mighty good care of me. I don't remember her name."
A whoosh of air released from Aranya's tight chest, and she wrapped her arms around her grandfather again. Hunched as he was with age, he still was taller than her, and even though she took care of him, She always felt like a small girl again when they embraced. "I wanted to make sure you were doing well," she said. "Here, why don't you sit? I've been hearing that you've been gardening recently."
"Oh, yes.
His smile was expansive, showing his few remaining teeth.
"I'm glad you're home."
"Just for tonight," she reminded him. He chuckled.
"I'm glad you're home."
The corners of her mouth lifted, but she couldn't stop her brow from creasing in worry. Once she had him sitting on his mat by the fire, she stoked the flames and found that Na had restocked the woodpile. Gratitude welled in her heart. "Have you eaten? Shall I fix you something?"
"Oh, no, I reckon I haven't."
More titters. Na hadn't fed him when she checked on him? Aranya pursed her lips, but got to her feet and went to the part of their tenement that functioned as a kitchen. "Once I'm back for good," she mumbled under her breath, "I'm unpacking this place completely. I'll make it more welcoming and comfortable." She bustled about for a while, making soup and tidying up as best she could. When she handed a warm, filled bowl to Ye, he chuckled and took it.
"I'm not hungry,"
he said with a grin.
"But the bowl sure is warm."
"You're not hungry? Why not?"
"The other lady, the one who has been visiting me, she made me something."
"So you did eat?" Ye only chuckled in response. Aranya's own soup, though little more than broth, went down heavy around the knot in her throat. Ye bent happily over the steaming bowl, its contents untouched. She managed to say, "Well, enjoy the warmth, Ye." By the time she'd settled him into bed, this time in his cat form, and taken care of the dishes, she couldn't hold herself together. She picked up her cloak from the rack by the door, went to the farthest corner of the tenement, and pressed the fabric into her face. She didn't want to wake Ye with her crying. The scratchy folds caught her tears and muffled the sounds of her sobs. Had she simply been so unaware of his decline because she saw him every day? And now that she'd been away for a few weeks, she saw the stark reality more clearly? If she left him tomorrow, would he still be here when she returned? It was Kai who knocked on her door far too early the next morning. She dragged herself away from the sleeping bundle she'd been stroking by the fire, shouldered her satchel, and drew in a deep breath through her nose. She closed the door softly and followed behind Kai's tall form through the dark hallway of the tenement, their steps creaking on the bowed floorboards. He was like a shadow ahead of her, looming and silent. Sometimes she forgot what they were to each other. In the middle of battles, of saving each other's lives, of secret missions, it was easy to forget that he was the reason she had to leave her grandfather. If he hadn't shown up at Sushui ward post, she'd have taken her position as a warden, would have been properly trained so she wasn't making mistakes, wasn't feeling the need to prove herself. She would have studied and learned and succeeded, just like she'd done at the academy. But Kai, who could have had any number of appointments, being an Evanescer, had wanted this one, hers, a humble wardenship. And how was a partial shapeshifter supposed to compete with an Evanescer? He was the reason she didn't have the appointment she earned, the reason she couldn't pay the fine. Despite how he might act at times, Shi Kai wasn't her friend. He wasn't her comrade either. He was her rival, her enemy. And he stood in the way of everything she wanted. It was a bitter realization, but it was true.